The chamber went silent the moment my hand rose against the vote. I am Claire Whitfield, junior delegate for the planet Earth, and in that heartbeat, every eye in the Grand Council of 1,000 worlds turned toward me like I had just set myself on fire in front of them. The resolution on the table was simple and cruel. A newly discovered civilization, still learning to walk between their own stars, was about to lose its protection. Once that protection was gone, older empires could move in and take whatever they wanted from that world. Metals, water, land, even the people, if the right loophole was found. Every other delegate in that chamber had already voted yes without blinking. It was routine to them. It was Tuesday. I voted no. For 3 full seconds, nobody moved. Then the laughter started, low at first, spreading from the outer benches where the older species sat, until it rolled through the whole chamber like a wave breaking on rock. I kept my hand raised and my spine straight, while a room full of beings older than human civilization itself laughed at a single vote from a species they still measured in decades, not centuries. The Grand Speaker sat above us all on a platform of pale light, a tall being named Vos Kalrath, skin like polished stone, voice like something poured rather than spoken. He looked down at me the way someone looks at a child who has just interrupted an important meeting with a crayon drawing. "Delegate Whitfield," he said, and the chamber quieted just enough for his words to land clean. "Earth has cast the only dissenting vote in this chamber in over 400 cycles. Do you understand what that vote accomplishes?" "It accomplishes nothing," I said. "I know that. I voted anyway." More laughter. Somewhere behind me, one of the older delegates, a broad being from a species called the Threlin, said something in his own language that translated roughly to "how sweet" across the chamber feed. I did not turn around. I had learned a long time ago that turning around only gives an insult more room to breathe. Vos Kalrath raised a hand, and the chamber fell into obedient silence, the kind of silence that comes from practice, not respect. "You are a species of children," he said, "clinging to a morality your own history proves you cannot afford. Earth has existed among the stars for what, 60 of your years? You have not yet lost a war that mattered. You have not yet had to choose between your principles and your survival. When you have, you will understand why this chamber does not vote with its heart." I could have stayed quiet. My instructions from Earth's council were clear enough. Keep the peace. Don't make waves. We are still too small to matter to anyone in that room. But something in me refused to sit down without saying the one thing that had been building in my chest since the session began. "Maybe that is exactly why we voted the way we did," I said. "We haven't lost enough to stop caring what we do to the people who are weaker than us. Give us time. We might." For a moment, something flickered across Vos Kalrath's face that was not quite anger and not quite curiosity. Then it was gone, replaced by the same tired patience he used on every junior delegate who spoke out of turn. "Noted," he said, and moved the session forward as if I had never spoken at all. I sat down. My hands were steady, which surprised me, because inside I felt like a wire pulled too tight, humming with something I could not yet name. Around me, the vote results scrolled across the chamber display in golden light. 999 worlds in favor, 1 world against. Earth, alone, at the bottom of a list that stretched further than my eyes could comfortably follow. After the session ended, delegates filed out in loose clusters, still trading amused glances in my direction. A few of the older ones did not bother hiding their laughter anymore, now that the recording had stopped. One delegate, a slender being from a trading species called the Corvi, actually stopped beside me on his way out and patted my shoulder with something between pity and amusement. "You have spirit, little one," he said. "Spirit is a fine thing to have before you learn how the galaxy actually works." I did not answer him. I watched him walk away, robes trailing behind him, completely certain that nothing Earth did in that chamber would ever matter beyond a footnote in the minutes. I stayed in my seat long after the chamber had mostly emptied, staring at the golden numbers still glowing faintly above the floor. 1 world against 999. It should have felt like failure. Instead, it felt like the first quiet click of a door being unlocked, the kind of sound nobody else in the room was close enough to hear yet. They thought Earth was alone in that vote. They were wrong, though they had no way of knowing it yet. What none of them understood, what none of them had bothered to learn in 60 years of watching us from a comfortable distance, was that Earth had never actually been playing the same game they were playing. While the older empires spent centuries building fleets to intimidate each other, humanity had spent its short time among the stars building something far less visible and far more dangerous: trust. I thought about the small delegation from the very civilization this resolution was about to condemn, a species called the Mirren, still years away from developing warp travel of their own. 2 of their observers had been allowed into the chamber that day, seated far in the back where the light barely reached, silent because they had no voting power, and everyone in that room knew it. I had met their lead observer once before, a quiet, careful being named Terrell, during a supply mission Earth had quietly run to their outer colonies 18 months earlier. We hadn't gone there to be seen. We hadn't gone there for credit or trade rights or mining contracts. We had gone because they needed clean water filtration technology, and nobody else in the galaxy had bothered to offer it to them for free. As I stood to leave the chamber, I caught Terrell's eye across the emptying rows. He did not smile, because his species did not smile the way humans did, but something in the way he inclined his head toward me felt like the closest thing to gratitude I had seen all day. It was such a small gesture. Nobody else in that chamber even noticed it happen. Walking out through the long marble corridors of the council building, I passed delegations from a dozen different empires, all of them moving with the unhurried confidence of species who had never once had their power questioned. Golden light poured through high-arched windows that looked out over a city built to impress rather than to welcome. Everything about that place was designed to remind visitors of their own smallness. I had walked those halls 100 times since arriving as Earth's delegate, and every single time I felt the weight of being watched, measured, and quietly dismissed. But that day felt different. That day, for the first time, I did not feel small. I felt like a single spark landing on dry grass, and I wondered how long it would take before anyone in that golden city noticed the smoke. By the time I reached the transport platform outside, my communicator was already buzzing with messages from home. Earth's council wanted to know why I had broken protocol. They wanted to know if I understood the risk of standing alone against every major power in known space. I read the messages twice, then closed the channel without answering right away, because I needed a moment first to simply breathe in the strange electric calm that had settled over me. Somewhere behind me, inside that golden chamber, the grand speaker was already moving on to the next item on the agenda, already forgetting the small, stubborn vote from a species he considered barely worth his attention. He had no idea that in refusing to look away from what was right, Earth had just planted the first seed of something that would eventually reach every corner of the galaxy he ruled. I looked up at the twin moons hanging pale and quiet over the council city, and for the first time since arriving on this world, I allowed myself a small, private smile. Let them laugh, I thought. Let them believe that a single vote from a young, unimportant species meant nothing at all. They would learn soon enough exactly how wrong they were, because what none of them had bothered to ask, in all their years of watching humanity from a comfortable, condescending distance, was the one question that actually mattered. Not how powerful was Earth's fleet, or how advanced was Earth's technology, or how many worlds humanity could claim as its own. The question they never thought to ask was simple. Who did Earth choose to stand beside when nobody was watching, and what were those choices quietly building, one small kindness at a time, while the rest of the galaxy laughed? I turned my communicator back on and finally answered my council's worried messages with 4 words that would later be repeated in history lessons across a dozen worlds. I do not regret it. Then I stepped onto the transport platform, and the golden city fell away behind me, still laughing, still certain, still completely unaware of what it had just awakened. The people who mocked me that day would remember my name eventually, not because of the vote itself, but because of everything that vote quietly set into motion. But on that first evening, walking away from the council chamber with the weight of 1,000 worlds' amusement still ringing in my ears, even I did not fully understand how far the consequences of one small act of decency were about to travel. I only knew one thing for certain as the stars came out over that unfamiliar sky. Earth had just told the galaxy exactly who we were. Now we would have to prove it. To understand why I raised my hand that day, you have to understand what Earth had actually been doing during the 60 years nobody in that chamber bothered to watch closely. Most of the older empires only ever saw our diplomats. They saw polished uniforms, careful language, and treaties written to avoid offending anyone powerful. They saw a species still learning the rules of a game everyone else had been playing for thousands of years, and they assumed that was the whole story. It never occurred to them to ask what humanity was doing in the quiet corners of the galaxy where nobody important was watching. 8 years before that vote, Earth sent its first real expedition beyond council-controlled space, not toward a wealthy trading hub or a strategic mining world, but toward a small, struggling colony belonging to a species called the Doven. The Doven were farmers, mostly, spread across 3 modest planets, with no fleet worth mentioning, and no seat on the council at all. They had been quietly ignored by every major empire for generations, useful only as a source of cheap agricultural exports and nothing more. Our expedition wasn't sent to extract anything from them. It was sent because a young engineer named Henry Dawson had read a report about a failing irrigation system on their homeworld and could not stop thinking about it. He petitioned Earth's council for 3 months before they finally agreed to send a small team, more out of curiosity than strategy. Nobody back home expected much to come of it. I still remember reading Henry's first transmission back to Earth, describing fields that stretched to the horizon, dying slowly under a sun that had grown slightly too intense for the Doven's outdated systems. His team spent 4 months there, not negotiating trade rights, not securing resources, simply rebuilding irrigation networks with technology Earth was happy to share for free. When they left, the Doven elders offered payment in rare minerals mined from their northern continent. Henry's team declined. They asked only for one thing in return, a promise that if Earth ever needed a friend, the Doven would remember who had helped them first. That promise seemed almost sentimental at the time. Looking back now, it was the first stone laid in a foundation that would eventually hold up half the galaxy. Word of what Earth had done spread slowly at first, carried along quiet trade routes and small diplomatic channels the major empires never bothered to monitor closely. A year later, a delegation from a mining collective called the Ashari reached out to Earth directly, cautious and testing, wanting to know if the rumors were true. Did the humans really help a species with nothing to offer in return? Our response was simple. We sent an engineer named Grace Ellison to help the Ashari repair a failing atmospheric processor on one of their outer stations, a job so unglamorous that no established empire would have wasted a single ship on it. Grace stayed for 6 weeks. She trained their local technicians so they would never need outside help again. When she left, the station's chief administrator asked her why Earth kept doing this, kept spending resources on worlds too small and too poor to matter to anyone else. Grace's answer, which later became something of a quiet motto among our diplomatic corps, was recorded in the Ashari's own historical archives. Because someone has to, she told him, and it might as well be us. Story after story like this began quietly stacking up across the years that followed. A colony ship for a displaced group called the Kesh, who had lost their homeworld to a resource dispute nobody powerful cared enough to mediate fairly. Medical supplies rushed to a plague-stricken outpost belonging to a species so small they didn't even have a name recognized by the Council's official registry. Technology shared freely with anyone willing to use it responsibly. No strings attached, no hidden contracts, no quiet expectation of future obedience. None of it made headlines in the golden halls of the Council. None of it was designed to. Earth wasn't trying to build an empire through charity. We were simply trying to be the kind of neighbor we wished someone had been for us during our own difficult early years among the stars. But somewhere along the way, without any of us fully planning it, those quiet acts of decency began weaving themselves into something much larger than any single mission ever intended. By the time of that fateful vote, Earth had built working relationships with over 40 small and mid-sized civilizations scattered across Council space, none of them powerful enough individually to matter in any grand strategic calculation, but every single one of them remembering exactly who had shown up when nobody else would. I learned the full scope of this network only gradually, piece by piece, during my years serving as Earth's delegate. It was Ambassador Daniel Ashford, the quiet, careful diplomat who trained me during my first months in the Golden City, who finally laid it all out clearly one evening in his private office overlooking the council skyline. "They think we're naive," he told me, pouring 2 cups of tea neither of us particularly wanted, just something to hold while we talked. "They think every kind act we perform is either an accident or a weakness waiting to be exploited. What they don't understand is that we've been building something the old empires forgot how to build a long time ago." "What's that?" I asked. "Loyalty that isn't bought," he said, "the kind that doesn't disappear the moment a better offer comes along." I thought about that conversation often in the months leading up to the vote. I thought about it again standing in that laughing chamber, watching Voss Kalrath dismiss Earth as a species of naive children who hadn't yet learned how the galaxy really worked. He wasn't entirely wrong about one thing: we hadn't learned to play the galaxy's usual game of intimidation and extraction. But he was completely wrong to assume that meant we were weak. What none of the older empires understood, what none of them had bothered to calculate into their endless assessments of relative fleet strength and resource control, was that trust travels faster and further than any warship ever could. While the Council's major powers spent their energy competing with each other for dominance, quietly stockpiling weapons and posturing over territorial claims, Earth had spent that same energy building a web of quiet debts and genuine friendships spread across dozens of worlds that the Council barely acknowledged existed. It wasn't a plan, not in the beginning. It became one gradually, the way a path becomes a road simply because enough people choose to walk it the same way, over and over, until eventually there is no other way to imagine getting where you need to go. I remember the exact moment I began to understand just how significant this quiet network had become. It happened roughly 6 months before the vote, during a private meeting Earth's Council held with representatives from 12 different small civilizations who had all, independently, reached out asking the same question. They had heard whispers that Earth might soon face serious trouble with the Council's major powers over a series of increasingly bold diplomatic positions we had taken. They wanted to know, plainly and directly, what Earth would need from them if that trouble ever became real. I sat in the back of that meeting, watching representatives from the Dovan, the Ashari, the Kesh, and a dozen other species I had come to consider genuine friends over the years, offer support that ranged from shared intelligence networks, to hidden supply routes, to small but capable defense forces that combined represented a coalition nobody in the Golden City had ever bothered to imagine existed. A representative named Margaret Fenwick, who had spent years serving as Earth's liaison to several of these smaller civilizations, summarized the meeting's conclusion in words I have never forgotten. "We spent years being told that kindness without immediate return was a waste of resources," she said. Today, 40 different worlds just proved that assumption wrong in a single afternoon. I left that meeting understanding something that would carry me through every difficult moment still ahead of us. Earth was never actually alone in that council chamber, not even during the vote that made us look, to everyone watching, like a single stubborn voice shouting uselessly into an empty room. We simply hadn't needed to prove that yet. The old empires had built their power through fear and extraction, through centuries of taking whatever they wanted from anyone too weak to refuse them. That system had worked for so long that nobody in the Golden City could imagine an alternative foundation strong enough to challenge it. They measured strength in fleets and territory and ancient bloodlines. They had simply never learned to measure the quiet, patient strength of a promise kept, repeated across enough worlds, for long enough, that it eventually became something far more powerful than any weapon ever built. As the Council's anger over our single dissenting vote began to grow in the days that followed, spreading through diplomatic channels and private meetings across the Golden City, I found myself returning again and again to something Ambassador Ashford had told me during that quiet evening in his office. "Let them underestimate us," he had said, setting down his tea with a small, knowing smile. "Every empire that has ever fallen throughout history fell because it stopped believing anyone smaller than itself could ever pose a genuine threat. We should be very grateful the Council still believes that about us." I didn't fully understand the weight of his words until the sanctions began. The sanctions arrived exactly 9 days after the vote, delivered through a formal council notice that Ambassador Ashford read aloud to Earth's entire diplomatic staff in a voice carefully stripped of emotion, though I could see the tension in his shoulders as he spoke. Earth's trade privileges within council space would be suspended immediately. Our observer status, the small measure of standing that allowed us any voice at all in future sessions, was revoked, pending what the notice called a period of reflection. And in language buried deep within the formal wording, so carefully worded that it took our legal team nearly an hour to fully translate its true meaning, the Council authorized a coalition of member empires to take what it called corrective action against any world found to be undermining the stability of established Council governance. Nobody used the word invasion. Nobody had to. We all understood exactly what those words meant. Word of the sanctions reached Earth within hours, and the response from our own government arrived almost as quickly, a flood of urgent messages demanding to know how we intended to respond. I sat in Ambassador Ashford's office that evening, watching him read through message after message from officials back home, each one more anxious than the last. "They want us to apologize," he said finally, setting his datapad down on the desk between us. "Officially rescind the vote. Ask the Council for forgiveness and hope they accept it before this goes any further." "Will you recommend that?" I asked. He was quiet for a long moment, staring out the window at the Golden City stretched below us, lights beginning to flicker on as evening settled over the Council world. When he finally answered, his voice carried none of its usual careful diplomacy. "No," he said, "I won't, but it isn't entirely my decision anymore." The days that followed felt like standing in the eye of a storm that everyone could see building except us. Earth's Council convened emergency sessions almost daily, split sharply between those who believed we should apologize immediately and preserve whatever fragile standing we still had, and those who believed backing down now would only confirm every insult the Council had ever thrown at us, that we were, in fact, nothing more than frightened children who folded the moment real pressure arrived. I found myself caught in the middle of that argument more often than I wanted to be, called into private meetings where officials far more senior than me demanded to know what I thought Earth should do. I told them the truth every single time, even when it wasn't the answer they wanted to hear. "If we apologize now," I said during one particularly tense session, "we aren't just giving up on the Mirren. We're telling every small civilization who has ever trusted us that our word means nothing the moment someone powerful pushes back. We're telling Terrell and Henry and Grace and everyone who has spent years building relationships based on Earth, actually meaning what it says, that none of it was real, that we were only ever kind when kindness was safe." A senior official named Edward Price, who had never fully supported our diplomatic approach even before the vote, leaned forward across the table with visible frustration. "And if we don't apologize," he said, "we may not have a planet left to worry about protecting anyone's trust." Nobody had a good answer to that. The truth was, none of us knew for certain how far the Council was willing to go to make an example of us. Earth's fleet, while more capable than most of the older empires assumed, was still nowhere near strong enough to face a coordinated coalition alone. If this became a genuine confrontation, we would be badly outnumbered, and everyone in that room understood it. I left that meeting that evening more uncertain than I had been since the day of the vote itself. Walking back through the Golden City's quiet streets toward my quarters, I found myself thinking about every small act of kindness Earth had performed over the years, every quiet promise made to a struggling world with nothing to offer in return except gratitude. I thought about Terrell's small nod across the emptying council chamber, and Margaret Fenwick's words from that meeting 6 months earlier, about 40 worlds proving in a single afternoon that trust could be worth more than resources. That night, I sent a single message home, addressed not to Earth's official council, but to Ambassador Ashford directly, the person I trusted most to understand exactly what I meant. "Hold the line," I wrote. "They are about to find out why we never stopped building relationships instead of walls." His response arrived within the hour, short but certain. "Already ahead of you," he wrote back. "The quiet network you've been watching grow for years is no longer quiet. Word has already reached every world we've ever helped. They are asking what we need." I read that message 3 times before setting my communicator down, feeling something steady settle into my chest for the first time since the sanctions arrived. We were not simply hoping our years of quiet kindness would matter now that we needed them. We were actively finding out, in real time, exactly how much they mattered. 2 weeks after the sanctions were announced, Council intelligence confirmed what everyone had feared, but nobody had wanted to say aloud. A coalition fleet, assembled from 4 of the Council's most powerful member empires, was moving toward Earth's system, officially described as a routine deployment to ensure regional stability, though nobody believed that description for a moment. I remember exactly where I was when that news reached the Golden City, standing in the small garden outside Earth's diplomatic residence, watching the twin moons rise over a skyline that had felt, only weeks earlier, impossibly foreign and unwelcoming. Now it simply felt like the calm before something enormous. Ambassador Ashford found me there that evening, his expression carrying a weight I had never seen on him before. "The fleet will reach Earth's system in approximately 11 days, he said quietly. 4 empires. Combined, more warships than Earth has ever built in our entire history among the stars." "What does Holmes say?" I asked. "Holmes says they are not backing down," he said, and for the first time since I had known him, I saw something that looked almost like pride flicker across his careful features. "Every ally we have ever helped has been contacted. Every quiet promise we have ever kept is being called in, not as a demand, but as an offer freely given in return." I thought about Henry Dawson's irrigation systems on Doven farmland, about Grace Ellison's 6 weeks spent training Ashari technicians who would never need outside help again, about medical supplies rushed to plague-stricken outposts with no name in any official council registry. None of those acts had been performed with this moment in mind. That was, I realized standing in that quiet garden, exactly why they mattered so much now. The Council, in all its centuries of calculated power and careful intimidation, had never once considered that a young species might build its strength not through fear, but through the simple, patient accumulation of genuine trust. They had spent so long believing that only force could guarantee loyalty that they had completely forgotten another kind of strength existed, one that could not be measured in fleet numbers or territorial control, one that revealed itself only when everything else had already failed. As the days counted down toward the coalition fleet's arrival, reports began reaching Earth's diplomatic staff from unexpected sources scattered across Council space. Small defense forces from a dozen different worlds were quietly repositioning. Shared intelligence networks, built over years of genuine cooperation rather than forced alliance, began funneling real-time information about the coalition fleet's exact composition and movement patterns. Supply routes that the major empires had never bothered to monitor, because they had never imagined anyone small enough to use them mattering, began moving resources toward positions that would prove critical in the days ahead. None of it happened through official council channels. None of it required treaties or formal declarations. It happened simply because dozens of worlds, remembering exactly who had shown up for them during years when nobody else had bothered, chose freely to show up for Earth in return. I stood in Ambassador Ashford's office on the final evening before the Coalition fleet was expected to arrive, watching updated positioning reports scroll across his display, feeling something I hadn't expected to feel given everything at stake. Not fear, though fear was certainly present somewhere beneath the surface. What I felt most strongly, standing there in that quiet golden city that had mocked us only weeks earlier, was a strange, steady kind of certainty. "They still think this is Earth alone against 4 empires," I said quietly. Ambassador Ashford looked up from the display and for the first time in weeks allowed himself a small, tired smile. "Let them keep thinking that," he said, "for exactly as long as it takes them to learn otherwise." Outside the window, the golden city glowed on, unaware and unconcerned, still certain that the galaxy's oldest rules would hold exactly as they always had. Somewhere far beyond its comfortable borders, a coalition fleet moved steadily closer to a planet the Council believed stood entirely alone. They had no idea what they were about to sail into. The coalition fleet arrived at the edge of Earth's system exactly on schedule, 4 empires' worth of warships spread across the darkness like a warning written in cold light. I watched the arrival unfold from Earth's Central Command Center, standing beside Ambassador Ashford and a room full of officials who had spent the last 11 days preparing for a confrontation none of them had ever truly believed we could survive alone. The fleet's commanding vessel, a massive Threllan warship, opened a formal communication channel almost immediately, broadcasting a message intended less for negotiation and more for demonstration. A tall, broad-shouldered commander named Counselor Threk appeared on our main display, his expression carrying the same casual confidence I remembered from the council chamber weeks earlier. "Earth," he said, his voice carrying easily across the silent command center, "you have been given every opportunity to correct your course. This fleet has been assembled not to punish you, but to remind you of your place within the order that governs this galaxy. Stand down your defenses and prepare to formally rescind your vote. Cooperation now will spare your world unnecessary difficulty." Ambassador Ashford stepped forward to respond, his voice remarkably steady given the weight of everything riding on his next words. "Counselor Threk," he said, "Earth has heard the Council's demands. We respectfully decline to comply." A ripple of surprise moved visibly across the commander's features, quickly replaced by something colder and more calculating. "Then you understand what happens next." "We understand exactly what you believe happens next," Ashford replied. "I would encourage you to check your fleet's sensor readings before proceeding further." I watched Counselor Threk's expression shift from confusion to something closer to alarm as reports began reaching his own command staff, visible even through the strained quality of our transmission. Across the edges of what his fleet had assumed was open, empty space surrounding Earth's system, dozens of smaller vessels were beginning to emerge from positions his sensors had somehow failed to detect until that exact moment. Ships from the Dovan, modest but well-maintained defense vessels built from technology Earth, had shared freely years earlier. Ashari mining transports retrofitted with shielding systems developed through years of genuine technological cooperation. Kesh patrol craft, faster and more maneuverable than anything the Coalition fleet had accounted for in their strategic planning. Dozens of smaller worlds, each contributing exactly what they could, none individually significant enough to concern a fleet built to intimidate a single young species, but together forming a presence that suddenly made the Coalition's confident numbers look considerably less overwhelming. "This is not possible," Counselor Threk said, and for the first time since the transmission began, his careful composure cracked into something closer to genuine confusion. "These worlds have no standing within Council governance. They have no formal alliance with Earth on record." "No formal alliance," Ashford agreed calmly. "Just years of choices that apparently mattered more than your Council ever bothered to notice." What followed over the next several hours was not the swift, decisive show of force the Coalition fleet had clearly expected when they set out toward Earth's system. It was something far more complicated, a tense standoff that gradually revealed just how badly the Council's oldest assumptions about power had failed to account for a galaxy quietly changing beneath their notice. The Coalition fleet held every advantage in raw firepower. That much remained true throughout the confrontation. But raw firepower, it turned out, mattered considerably less when an opposing force understood every weakness in your formation, every gap in your supply lines, every predictable pattern in your movement, information gathered patiently over years by allies the Coalition had never once considered worth watching. I stood in that command center, watching real-time reports scroll across our displays, describing not a battle in any traditional sense, but something closer to a carefully coordinated demonstration of exactly how thoroughly the Coalition's confidence had outpaced their actual understanding of the situation. Doven vessels, working in coordination with Earth's own defense fleet, disrupted Coalition supply routes established years earlier through outdated intelligence. Ashari transports, using shielding technology the Coalition had assumed only major empires possessed, absorbed and redirected early defensive maneuvers meant to intimidate rather than genuinely harm. Kesh patrol craft, moving with speed and precision built from years of practical cooperation rather than theoretical strategy, repeatedly outmaneuvered Coalition formations designed to overwhelm a single, isolated defender. Nobody on either side sought unnecessary destruction that day. Earth's strategy, developed carefully over the preceding 11 days, had never been to defeat the Coalition fleet through overwhelming force we simply did not possess. It had been to demonstrate, as clearly and undeniably as possible, that the Coalition's fundamental assumption that Earth stood entirely alone was simply, completely wrong. Within 6 hours, Coalition Command requested a temporary halt to hostilities. Counselor Threck's expression, when he reappeared on our main display, had lost every trace of the casual confidence he carried during his opening transmission. "How long?" he asked, his voice noticeably strained. "Has Earth been building this network?" Ambassador Ashford's response carried no trace of triumph, only a quiet, steady honesty that somehow felt more powerful than any victory speech could have managed. "We were never building a network, Counselor," he said. "We were simply trying to be good neighbors to worlds your empires never bothered to notice. What you are witnessing today is not a fleet Earth assembled to fight you. It is friendship, freely given, choosing to show up when it mattered most." The silence that followed stretched long enough that I began to wonder if the transmission had failed entirely. When Counselor Threck finally spoke again, his voice carried something I had never expected to hear from a council commander sent to intimidate a supposedly weaker world. "This changes things," he said quietly, more to himself than to us. "This changes everything." Within the following 2 days, the Coalition fleet began a slow, deliberate withdrawal from Earth's system, officially described in council records as a strategic repositioning rather than a retreat, though everyone who had watched the confrontation unfold understood exactly what had actually happened. News of what occurred at the edge of Earth's system spread through council space far faster than any official statement could control, carried not through formal diplomatic channels, but through the same quiet networks of genuine relationship that had made Earth's defense possible in the first place. I remember standing in the command center as the last Coalition vessel disappeared from our sensors, watching Ambassador Ashford finally allow the exhaustion of the last 11 days show plainly on his face for the first time. Around us, officials who had spent nearly 2 weeks preparing for what many privately believed would be Earth's darkest hour instead found themselves processing something closer to disbelief. "We didn't win a war today," Ashford said quietly, mostly to himself, though I heard every word clearly. "We simply proved that the Council's oldest rule was never actually true." "Which rule?" I asked. "That power only ever comes from fear," he said. "Every empire in that chamber has spent centuries believing that loyalty must be extracted, that smaller worlds only ever cooperate with larger ones out of necessity or terror. They built their entire understanding of the galaxy around that single assumption. Today, 40 different worlds proved them wrong, not because we forced them to fight beside us, but because we never gave them a reason not to. I thought about Tyrell's quiet nod across that laughing council chamber weeks earlier, about Henry Dawson's irrigation systems and Grace Ellison's 6 patient weeks training Ashari technicians who would never need outside help again. None of those small, unremarkable acts of decency had been performed with this moment in mind. That, I understood now more clearly than ever, was precisely why they had mattered enough to change everything. Word of Earth's successful defense reached the Golden Council city within days, carried through diplomatic channels that could no longer pretend the confrontation had gone according to anyone's original expectations. I imagined, though I could not know for certain, what that news must have felt like arriving in Voss Kalrath's chambers, shattering whatever comfortable certainty had allowed him to laugh so easily at a single dissenting vote weeks earlier. The Coalition's retreat did not end the tension between Earth and the Council's older powers, not immediately. Formal negotiations would stretch on for months afterward, careful and complicated, as both sides worked to understand exactly what had changed and what it meant for a galactic order that had remained largely unquestioned for longer than most species could accurately remember. But something fundamental had shifted at the edge of Earth's system that day, something that no amount of careful diplomatic language could fully undo. The Council had sent 4 empires to remind a young species of its place within an old and comfortable hierarchy. Instead, they had discovered that the hierarchy itself rested on assumptions far less solid than anyone had ever bothered to question. Power, it turned out, was not simply a matter of fleet numbers and territorial control. It could also be built quietly, patiently, one honest relationship at a time, until the day it was needed most. Standing in that command center, watching the last traces of Coalition presence fade from our sensors, I finally allowed myself to feel something I had been holding back since the moment I first raised my hand against that vote weeks earlier. Not triumph, exactly. Something quieter and steadier than that. Relief, mixed with a growing certainty that the galaxy Voss Kalrath had described so confidently in that golden chamber, a galaxy where power alone determined worth, was already beginning to change in ways the old empires were only beginning to understand. They had mocked Earth's single vote as meaningless. They had sent a fleet believing Earth stood entirely alone. What they discovered instead was that the smallest, quietest choices, repeated patiently across enough years and enough worlds, could eventually reshape the entire balance of a galaxy that had grown far too comfortable believing nothing ever truly changes. The Golden City's laughter had finally, completely stopped. 6 months after the Coalition fleet withdrew from Earth's system, I returned to the Council chamber for what would become one of the most important sessions in the galaxy's recent history, and the room I walked into looked almost nothing like the one I had left behind. The change was visible before the session even began, where once the chamber's outer benches had been reserved almost exclusively for representatives of the oldest and most powerful empires, new seats had been added. Modest additions built quickly and without much ceremony, filled now with delegates from worlds the Council had spent generations quietly ignoring. I saw Tyrell seated among them, representing the Mirren with full voting rights for the first time in his species' history. Nearby sat a representative from the Dovan, and beside her, delegates from the Ashari and the Kesh, all of them present not as observers tolerated out of obligation, but as full participants whose voices now carried genuine weight within Council governance. Ambassador Ashford walked beside me toward Earth's designated seating, and I noticed him glancing around the transformed chamber with quiet satisfaction he made little effort to hide. It took a fleet's failed intimidation to accomplish what 100 years of careful diplomacy never managed, he said softly, more to himself than to me. "What's that?" I asked. Convincing this Council that the worlds they've spent generations dismissing were actually worth listening to all along. I found my own seat, the same modest position I had occupied months earlier when I cast Earth's single dissenting vote against a resolution designed to strip protection from a struggling civilization. This time, however, I was not alone in the way I had been then. Around the chamber, Delegates from dozens of small and mid-sized worlds settled into their new seats, some visibly nervous, others carrying themselves with a quiet confidence that had clearly been earned rather than granted. The session opened with a formal address from a new Grand Speaker, a measured, careful being named Charlotte Hale, whose leadership had been established following months of significant restructuring within the Council's highest offices after Voss Kalrath's quiet removal from power in the aftermath of the failed coalition action. Her tone carried none of Kalrath's easy condescension, replaced instead by something far more cautious, the tone of someone who had learned, sometimes painfully, exactly how badly old assumptions could fail when tested against realities nobody had bothered to fully examine. Today, Grand Speaker Hale began, addressing the full chamber. This council revisits a resolution first brought before us nearly 7 months ago, concerning the protection status of newly discovered civilizations still developing their capabilities among the stars. A quiet murmur moved through the chamber, and I felt Ambassador Ashford's hand rest briefly on my shoulder, a small gesture of steady encouragement before the vote began. At that time, Hale continued, this resolution passed with only a single dissenting vote, cast by the delegate representing Earth. She paused, letting the weight of that history settle fully across the transformed chamber. Today, this council calls for a new vote on the same resolution, informed by everything that has occurred in the months since. I remember the strange, quiet stillness that settled over me as the voting sequence began, watching delegate after delegate cast their choice, no longer through the careless, automatic pattern I remembered from that first session, but with visible, deliberate consideration. When the final results scrolled across the chamber's golden display, the numbers told a story entirely different from the one recorded 7 months earlier. 942 votes against the resolution, 57 votes in favor. The measure failed by an overwhelming margin, and this time it was not humanity standing alone against an indifferent galaxy. It was an entire chamber, transformed by months of hard lessons, choosing collectively to protect exactly the kind of vulnerable civilization the resolution had originally intended to abandon. I sat quietly amid the shifting murmur of the chamber, watching Tyrell across the rows, his species now permanently secured under the same protection status Earth had once fought so publicly and so alone to defend. He caught my eye briefly, and this time, though his species still did not smile the way humans did, something in his posture carried an unmistakable warmth that needed no translation. After the session formally concluded, Grand Speaker Hale requested a private meeting with Earth's delegation before we departed the chamber. Ambassador Ashford and I followed her into a smaller side chamber, quieter and considerably less grand than the main hall, where she gestured for us to sit across from her at a simple table. I want to understand something clearly, she said, once the door had closed behind us. The network of relationships Earth built across these smaller worlds, was it ever truly a deliberate strategy, or did we genuinely misjudge something as simple as ordinary kindness? Ambassador Ashford considered the question carefully before answering. It was never a strategy, Grand Speaker. Not in the way your predecessor assumed. Earth never set out to build an alliance capable of challenging 4 empires. We simply believed that helping a struggling world without demanding anything in return was worth doing regardless of whether it ever benefited us directly. And yet it did benefit you, Hale said, significantly. It did, Ashford agreed, but I think that's exactly the lesson this council needed to learn. Genuine kindness doesn't need a strategic purpose to eventually matter. Sometimes it simply needs enough time and enough consistency before its true value becomes impossible to ignore. Grand Speaker Hale sat quietly with that answer for a long moment, her expression thoughtful rather than skeptical. Your predecessor, she said finally, addressing Ashford directly, believed the galaxy could only ever be governed through carefully balanced fear. I confess, I am still learning to imagine an alternative. You don't need to imagine it, I said, speaking for the first time since entering the room. You just watched it happen. 40 worlds chose to stand beside a species with no formal power to compel their loyalty, simply because that species had spent years proving its word actually meant something. That isn't a theory, Grand Speaker. That's exactly what happened at the edge of Earth's system 6 months ago. She studied me carefully for a long moment before finally nodding, something in her expression settling into quiet acceptance. Perhaps, she said, this council has spent far too long assuming that strength and kindness exist in opposition to one another. Our meeting ended shortly afterward, and Ambassador Ashford and I made our way back through the chamber's long marble corridors, past delegates from worlds old and new, all of them moving through a council building that felt, for the first time since my arrival there, genuinely different from the golden, unwelcoming halls I remembered from my very first session. Walking beside me, Ashford finally allowed himself a small, tired smile, the kind that comes only after a long and uncertain effort finally reaches solid ground. "Do you remember what Voss Calrath told you, that very first day?" he asked. "That we were a species of children clinging to a morality we couldn't afford," I said. "I remember every word." "He wasn't entirely wrong," Ashford said thoughtfully. "We were young. We hadn't yet lost enough to stop caring about the worlds weaker than ourselves. But he made one critical mistake in his assessment." "What mistake?" "He assumed that youth meant weakness," Ashford said. "He never considered that it might simply mean we hadn't yet learned to stop believing kindness was worth the cost." We stepped out of the council building into the golden evening light, and I found myself thinking back over everything that had unfolded since that very first vote. From Henry Dawson's quiet irrigation project on Dovan farmland, to Grace Ellison's patient weeks training Ashari technicians, from Margaret Fenwick's meeting with 40 grateful worlds, to the tense standoff at the edge of Earth's own system, where friendship, freely given, had proven stronger than any fleet the Council's oldest powers could assemble. None of it had happened because Earth set out to shatter the galaxy's old order. It had happened because, somewhere along the way, without ever fully realizing it, humanity had simply refused to stop believing that decency mattered, even when nobody powerful was watching, even when it seemed to offer nothing in return. Standing beneath that transformed golden sky, watching delegates from dozens of newly empowered worlds make their way home through streets that had once dismissed them entirely, I finally understood the true weight of everything that single dissenting vote had eventually accomplished. We had not won by becoming the strongest species in that chamber. We had won by remaining, patiently and consistently, exactly who we had always claimed to be, until an entire galaxy finally had no choice but to notice. The council that mocked Earth's vote had wanted us to learn how the galaxy truly worked. In the end, it was the galaxy that learned something far more important from us instead. Some promises are worth keeping, even when nobody is watching, especially when nobody is watching. And sometimes, that simple, quiet truth is enough to change absolutely everything.